Welcome everyone to Housing is a Social Good, the State of Social Housing Today. I'm Miriam, Axel-Lute, Editor-in-Chief of Shelterforce. I'm going to give a welcome to Shelterforce subscribers, and if you're not a subscriber, please sign up and get your housing news every Monday morning. It's free. I want to start this webinar just by acknowledging that we are living in dangerous and difficult times, especially in the United States, which is probably one of the reasons so many people are eager to be here today to talk about building up something positive instead of tearing things down. Social housing is one of those terms that shifts its meaning a lot. It came to us from Europe, where it usually refers to programs, most famously exemplified and studied in Vienna, where housing is provided by the public sector for a wide range of incomes. In the United States, it's taken on a different feel, encompassing a wider range of approaches to affordable housing, but is still especially those that don't involve short-term subsidies in the private market. But what it means and how it should be pursued and achieved is still debated in the field, and our panelists today bring a range of perspectives and experiences to bear on this question. And we hope today to lay out a vision of how we can move social housing forward, even under the current conditions. I'm going to pass things over right now to Steve Dubb from NPQ, my co-moderator and co-organizer of this and many other great webinars.
Thank you, Miriam. Hi, I'm Steve Dubb, pronouns he and him. I'm senior editor of economic justice at Nonprofit Quarterly, coming from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts Nation. And I was counting our joint webinars over the years, and I believe this is our 8th. And it has been an honor to partner with Shelterforce in these webinars. Which in Shelterforce is an institution, I think it's important to note, in housing and community development journalism, just celebrated its 50th anniversary last month. And if we were here in person, I think I would ask folks to applaud in the audience, but please show your love in the chat. It really is an extraordinary accomplishment to all the work that Shelterforce has done over the past 50 years. A quick note about NPQ, our mission is broad. We aim to advance conversations and practice in civil society, which I describe as the space between the family and the state where social meaning is contested and constructed. And we focus especially in terms of nonprofit, social movements, and philanthropy. And we've covered housing a lot over the years because housing is a basic need for all people, and making housing a public good and a human right should be the goal, not just of housers, but all of us in civil society. Miriam already alluded to the times that we are in. Obviously, many of us are facing scary defensive battles right now, but we still need to build for the future. So I'm glad to join Miriam and the panelists here today in that conversation. And with that, I pass the baton back to Miriam.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for following my own instructions and a reminder to the panelists to use pronouns and introductions, which I forgot to do. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm coming to you from Albany, which is land of the Haudenosaunee. So we're going to start off by having each of our panelists introduce themselves and give some brief introductory remarks, and then get into some deep conversation. And we're going to start first up with Jonathan Tarleton, author of Homes for Good and a member of the Shelterforce board.
Thank you, Miriam. It's so wonderful to be with you all today. I know it's sort of become a rote thing to say, but it is truly lovely to be in community with people like this today, especially right now. So I'm Jonathan Tarleton. I use he, him pronouns. I'm an urban planner. I've worked on housing from a number of perspectives at housing authorities, at community development corporations, with CDFIs, and as a researcher and writer. So I recently released a book called Homes for Living, The Fight for Social Housing in a New American Commons. And this book really centers on a model of social housing, a great, very successful model of social housing that we have here in the United States, that being New York City and State's Mitchell-Lama program. These are both rentals and co-ops, but I focus mainly on the limited equity co-ops where folks have been able to buy in at very low rates, with the deal being that when they leave, when they sell their share back to the co-op, they are not able to profit from that housing. So to the extent that folks can still buy a home in New York City today for $45,000, but they can't reap the massive perceived value of that home on the other end, thereby preserving it for future generations. So one of the risks, one of the challenges to this model is actually a controversial decision available to the cooperators themselves, which is to remove that resale restriction. So this was never intended in the program, but the cat is out of the bag, and there are very, very intense debates within co-ops about whether to go down this road. And the book centers around debates at two of these co-ops as a way to look at, how do we maintain these great public goods that we have once we build them? And given that this is a very successful model we already have, we can learn a lot as we seek to build new forms of social housing today, how to build in their maintenance long term. And so we can certainly get deeper into this, but I think if there's one thing I wanted to leave folks with today, it's really the idea that as much as we talk about the physical and the financial maintenance of these buildings and these communities, I think it's particularly important to also be focused on what I think of as the social maintenance of these places, the norms, the ideas that underlie this kind of housing, because the laws change, loopholes get opened, and the thing that allows us to preserve housing as a public good are the concept of this home as infrastructure, as a human right, not as a commodity. And with that, I will turn it back over to Miriam. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm not Miriam, but I'll take the next.
Sorry, Steve.
That's okay. We're alternating here. But I did want to pass the baton to Reverend Rae Huang from Los Angeles, and if you could introduce yourself and talk about the state of social housing organizing and the national trends you're seeing.
Sure, happy to. So yeah, I'm Reverend Rae Huang. I use she, they pronouns, and I am the senior organizer at Housing Now, which is a statewide housing justice coalition in the state of California. And I'm calling in from Tongva Land, also known as Los Angeles here in California. So some of the things in terms of what we're seeing around trends and in social housing organizing is that unlike 4 years ago when our coalition first decided that we wanted to focus on social housing as a priority for our long-term work to change our housing system to make it actually equitable and just, there was very little conversations about social housing. It was just a few of us who happened to have read a book about social housing or visited a country where social housing was popular, and we started having conversations. Now, 4 years later, it's amazing, how many articles, thanks to our wonderful partners here, Steve and Miriam, who have helped put this together, are beginning to publish more things about social housing, where we're seeing more education around social housing with tenants. And what we are seeing the boon of is actually a number of tenant unions and tenant organizations working together to where buildings are, run by slumlords, or where there has been such an extreme rising of rents, or in other cases where the low income housing tax credit unit, which is so buildings that have used the tax credits to be able to keep it affordable, they have an expiration date. And so after a period of 30 years or 55 years, when that expiration date ends, the rent actually, the affordability of that building is removed essentially, and there's no more tax credits to support that. And so the owners of that building then raise the rents to 300% in the case of here in Los Angeles, the Hillside Villa apartments in Chinatown here in Los Angeles. And so we've seen tenants gather together and say, you know, we need to remove these buildings from these profit interests and put it into our own hands. And what are ways that we can actually try and buy back this building, apply pressure to this corporate landlord that's a slumlord to pressure them to give up the building and expose what's happening, and really put it back into community hands, which is social housing. And so that has been the kind of boon of organizing that's been happening amongst tenants. A huge piece of that is just simply political education, having local meetings, webinars, workshops around social housing itself, and then also creating policies and putting forth legislation that can help move in that direction. And that would be, for example, various opportunity to purchase acts. So we have COPA, Community Opportunity Purchase Act, TOPA, Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act, even MOPA, Manufactured Housing Opportunities to Purchase Act. We have all these basically giving the first right of refusal to tenants or to residents to be able to purchase buildings that are going up for sale or ought to be going up for sale because of how badly it's being taken care of. Other things that are happening as well on national trends and organizing is that there's been a number of developments of community land trusts, cooperatives, and land back movements led by Indigenous communities and organizations to be able to buy back land and have it owned by communities for to have them run. There's a number of revenue campaigns that have come up and been successful. For example, recently in Seattle, to be able to fund social housing development authorities, which are offices that are focused on being able to acquire, preserve, and develop social housing opportunities within those cities and districts. And then there's also, there's so much I can say about this. I wanted to highlight in particular one, which is that mobile home parks, a lot of times, because it is a smaller segment of our housing options here in the US, it is a growing one, particularly it's been historically a place where there's been naturally occurring affordable housing, where families, that's sort of one of the last resorts of places of housing for families. And with the same way that we've been seeing corporate landlords completely take over our units of housing of apartment buildings and complexes, we've been seeing that also in mobile home parks. And so there's also been an effort actually by mobile home residents to purchase their own parks. And so recently I wanted to highlight one in Fresno, the Comunidad Nuevo Lago, that recently purchased their park. And now these residents who have lived there and who were being essentially pushed out and they now have been able to gather together to purchase their park. So there's a lot more that I could say, but I think I'll leave it for the future time I have. Actually, I will say one more thing is that we did recently hold a first time ever national in-person convening of organizers across the country who are working on local social housing campaigns and statewide social housing campaigns to come together to start to organize collectively to advocate for what it is that we need on a national scale to be able to help us move towards the goals that we have. And I'll send it back to you, Steve and Miriam.
Great. Thank you, Rae. I'm going to pass it now to Fernando Martí to talk to us about stuff that's happening in San Francisco.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So great to see you all and see a bunch of names I recognize on the chat. So my name is Fernando Martí. I use he and him pronouns. Thank you for asking us to use our pronouns, just so people don't make assumptions. I teach at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and University of San Francisco, an architect and an artist. Actually just did some artwork for Rae, organization. And have been involved in the social housing discussion in San Francisco for a long time. I was co-director at the Council of Community Housing Organizations, which is our local coalition of affordable housing developers and community advocates for the last 11 years. And one of the things that was, I think, part of our agenda and a challenge was expanding among our members and the general public the vision of what housing is or could be. For so long, affordable housing has been defined as housing for the neediest, those most in need of housing, which is one way of looking at what the country needs to be producing, right? But very different from thinking of housing as a human right that should be available to all, and that should be part of our conversation in the same way that we think about social security as a right that we have and something that is needed for the infrastructure of healthy cities. So Miriam asked me to talk a little bit about what we've been doing in San Francisco. In 2019, we passed a couple of ballot measures, one of which called for authorizing the city to develop 10,000 units of social housing, and the second one on the same ballot measure, a revenue measure based on a transfer tax of real estate sales dedicated to innovative housing solutions, which included thinking about broad social housing, limited equity co-ops, other kinds of housing, and especially the kind of preservation programs that Rae mentioned. That same year, legislatively, we passed San Francisco's Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. I think it was the first such first right to purchase legislation in the state, maybe the first one in the country after Washington, D.C.'s TOPA, that has been in effect since, I think, the 1980s. So an idea of expanding this idea that when multifamily buildings are put up for sale, that the state has a position in buying those properties, taking them out of the market and creating decommodified housing. San Francisco's very specific version kind of gives nonprofits a first right to purchase. Since then, we've worked on a number of revenue measures, one which is very long-term, trying to develop a public bank for the city of San Francisco, a municipally run bank that would, one of its primary purposes would be to provide low risk and low interest lending capacity for the development of social housing. We also passed recently a revenue bond legislation, but more importantly, are in the middle of looking for a consultant. So it is out there, look it up on the LAFCO website. Looking for a partner to help develop a new agency within the city and county of San Francisco that would oversee the development of social housing. So what that looks like, what its financing mechanisms and so forth are still to be put kind of in the works. And I can talk more later about any questions around the details, but that's a little bit about kind of what we've been doing. I think the last thing I'll just say is maybe along with what other folks have talked about already of thinking about housing as a human right, as a decommodified thing that we have access to, is thinking about housing as homes rather than units, as places that are really where we live, where we develop ourselves as who we are, our children. And that's a very different way of looking at things than output of units. So that's just another piece to add to kind of defining social housing. And I'll pass it back to Miriam and Steve.
Great, thanks, Fernando. And Kristen, wanted to get you into the conversation. And I know you wrote a piece for Shelterforce last year about what's missing in the social housing conversation. So maybe you can touch on that as well.
Sure, thank you. So good morning or afternoon to anybody that's not on the West Coast. My name is Kristen Hackett, she, her. I currently work as a community organizer with My Eden Voice, a member-led organization in the unincorporated area of Alameda County in the San Francisco Bay Area. But prior to joining that team last year, I was living in New York City, where I was completing a PhD and organizing alongside public housing residents across the city to preserve public housing. It was with these neighbors and from this vantage point that I first learned about social housing. And from the beginning, we had some concerns. So for my comrades felt like it was like if others want to decommodify deeply affordable housing and resident management, that they should join the fight to preserve existing public housing and expand what that term means in the US in a technical and regulatory sense. Instead, the pivot on the left was read as a class and race-based fracture, with many concluding they want what we have, but they don't want it with us. These feelings were reinforced by articles that promoted social housing alongside negative falsehoods about public housing in an effort to distinguish between these two ideas. One of these enduring myths that aimed to enhance the image of social housing was the idea that public housing was exclusive because it only served low-income families. By contrast, social housing has been promoted as a mixed income model that would serve more households, right, across a larger income range. And this myth was just regurgitated to me again while preparing my remarks for today. However, as many residents will tell you, public housing is mixed income. There are households living on less than $10,000 a year, and there are households earning more than $100,000 a year. And as evidence of that, the New York City Housing Authority just a couple years ago created an income cap for public housing of $120,000 a year. And some people did lose their subsidy about that. So there's a very broad range of income levels of people who are living in public housing, one of the largest remaining social housing models right now in the country. And this is the income range that the best versions of social housing would be able to stably and affordably house. Instead, there's a lot of fine print in the plans for social housing that admit that without the federal funding that public housing has, social housing will be unlikely to address the needs of households most in need. And in my opinion, this means that therefore, with social housing moving forward right now, we're at risk of recreating and deepening the dual housing system and the social exclusions that capitalism relies on. And this is highly concerning at this particular historical juncture where houselessness is steadily rising and is now legally considered a criminal and fugitive state, where climate change is making houselessness a more life-threatening experience, where new construction that relies on modern techniques is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and therefore worsens these realities. And more generally, we seem to be ignoring the signs with blinking lights telling us that capitalism and its practices of society making are at odds with life on the planet overall. It is further concerning when we consider who is bearing the brunt of these changes at this time, which is the same communities that have been excluded from housing and land and state care since the American Project began. And threats to these communities are trumped up further under the current administration, play on words intended. I wanted to begin my remarks here today because to me, these are some of the uncomfortable truths that we need to contend with if we want the slogan "Housing for All" to be more than a catchphrase or worse, a red herring. Housing is central to individual and collective lives, and it's central to whatever system we use to organize our lives. We need to work towards undoing housing's central role in the capitalist system in order to begin working towards a future where housing is a human right. And I think to begin that work, we need to focus on undoing the relations of social exclusion that the present system relies on. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristen. Before we get into the conversation, I just want to say one thing that I failed to say before, which is that for everybody who's wondering, yes, this is being recorded. We will share the video and we will share a transcript. So this will be accessible in its entirety after it's over. Okay, we're now going to jump into our conversations, starting with Rae and and this to some extent follows on what Kristen just said, which is, what does social housing, what does that phrase mean to you? How else do you hear it being used? And what do you think are the promises and the dangers of those different angles?
Thanks. Yeah, I think Kristen did a great job of really actually capturing what the phrase means to me personally and in my work and for the organizations and members that I represent, which is that when we hear social housing, we hear housing is a human right. We hear that housing cannot be a commodity. Housing needs to be a right and a public good for everybody, no matter what race, gender, sexuality, class, background, where things like that. And I do want to though lean into just sort of what is social housing, because I saw that there was a question asked in the chat, and so I wanted to give a little bit of a further conversation about that. um, Housing Now is a member of the Alliance for Housing Justice, which is a coalition that was started um, after during the first term of Trump's administration, and by which we saw attacks on public housing, and so the Alliance for Housing Justice was created. And one of the goals of the Alliance for Housing Justice since that time actually is a focus on social housing. And so together with a collective of other organizations across the nation, we worked collaboratively to identify exactly what are the main principles that we all gathered around that we felt like could capture where we were on our while diverse experiences and development of social housing could still carry out what our mutual interests were or mutual values were. And those principles are that it would be socially owned by community. It would be permanently affordable, because we see a lot of current affordable units under the low-income housing tax credits, which is the primary way of creating affordable housing, that they all have limited covenants. And so to actually social housing would be one that would be permanently affordable, permanently decommodified, so that it would not return to the market and become again a profit-driven commodity, that it would be under community control, so that communities could determine for themselves what exactly they needed for their housing. Some are made up of young families who might want a small park. Others might need actually working washers and dryers, or when your lights need to get fixed, that you would actually have resident control to be able to make sure that your units are constantly updated, your homes are getting the modernization it needs for it to be successful and to be resilient against the changing climate. Another is that it would be anti-racist and equitable, so that way it would be available to all income levels, and particularly highlighting the fact that for those who need it the most, which is low income, extremely low income households. It would have strong tenant security. We've seen in other countries that that's been a huge component of successful social housing models, because if there is no security, then what is the point of a home? It's certainly not a viable long-term solution or sustainable. That'd be high quality and accessible, and that it'd be forever sustainable. So that way we can actually ensure that we are moving towards a long-term success of a world where our children actually have a place to thrive in the future, with the changing needs of our country with the climate change. So I just wanted to mention that to you, and I'll also drop in the chat for you all right now a link to the website where you can learn more about the Alliance for Housing Justice and other memos and articles that we have published over the last year or more around social housing ideas and thoughts. Now, to answer a little bit more, what does social housing, how is it being used, and what are the promises and dangers of the different angles? I would say that the promises, of course, is that we would actually create a system where housing is no longer a commodity, or we would change and while it would probably take, I don't see in the short term social housing being the model of the whole system of the country. We are currently not in a housing system or in a political climate or environment by which we can make every single home owned by the public, or by community ownership. But I think that it is a promise to be able to stabilize the rising prices that people just can't afford right now. But the dangers that we are seeing right now is that is that as we think about and try and apply social housing across the country, there is a concern that, for example, there are some models or some interest in trying to identify where we can find the right funding for social housing development and acquisition. And some people have wondered about private funding sources. And one of the challenges and one of the dangers with that is that if we do lean into private funding for social housing, it does then return back into the same old situation that we have, in which case then we are then it becomes another place of profit, or we are held accountable by needing to basically put that money back into the private interests. And then we lose that actual ability to make the social housing available to everybody and actually keeping it affordable. The other is that we want to ensure that one of the ways that social housing succeeds is that it doesn't have a repeat of history. Historically, we have made housing unaffordable or unavailable and inaccessible to communities by which they are of a certain class or a certain race or whatnot. And so what are the ways that we are going to have very strong protections and ensure that as our housing system continues, that we create strong legal protections to ensure that social housing is provided for those who need it the most, and those who are oftentimes historically left out again and again out of the housing market, out of an ability to actually have a home that is stable and sustainable for them. And so that looks like in many ways in terms of where housing is built, how housing is built, and then also resident control of being able to determine for themselves what they need in that housing, and ensuring that it doesn't return back to ownership or management by people who, or I would say private entities who want to control and also even, I would say, if you will, like racist and classist ways of thinking about who gets to own and how much they get to own, and how much available social housing is made to extremely low income and low income communities.
And or Jonathan, do you want to address the definition question briefly?
So,
Very briefly,
yeah.
because I do want to get on to the
Yeah,
next question, but you don't have to.
no, I'd love to. Thank you for that, Rae. That was wonderful. As I've been talking to folks across the country about social housing, one of the more intuitive ways that I found to think about it, and this does differ in slight ways to how Rae has framed it, is that it's any permanently affordable housing that is kept outside of the market and has some element of resident governance. And so, I think one of the areas in which that definition is a slightly bigger tint than how Rae framed it, is that, I actually don't think necessarily private ownership is incompatible with the concept of social housing when there are strong tenant protections, when tenant unions have leverage, when residents and tenants have a say in the governance of their homes. And I see the Community Service Society in New York has done great work on social housing, where they talk about it as a continuum. And there are many different models of this that range from public housing as, the largest and most significant source of social housing in the US that we have, to limited equity co-ops, to rentals with strong tenant protections. And each has drawbacks, benefits, different funding models, different abilities to push them forward. And I think, frankly, an approach to as many different kinds of this model that fit under that overall umbrella is quite important, and still fulfill a lot of, almost all of the principles that Rae outlined in terms of accessibility and serving folks from across a range of different income levels. So I just thought I would offer that definition as well.
Kristen, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, sorry, I thought Fernando was going to go. Yeah,
Okay.
so kind of as I was explaining, so a lot of the way I understood social housing initially was sort of like, oh, it's not public housing. And even folks that I was talking to at that time that were organizing around social housing were saying, well, we just can't use the word social housing because it's been so denigrated over time. But I think the other benefit of the frame social housing is that it is a broader term that refers to lots of different kinds of housing models. I think its elasticity is sort of helpful for building like a larger tent. And like Rae, I think was saying, it's really set around or a set of values and commitments, right? That defines sort of what social housing is. But I do think that the technical and financial questions are really important for thinking about like how successful we are in achieving that. And I think there's a lot more work to be done on that. And I think some of my concerns around how social housing is being used in part because of the elasticity of the term, is around sort of the new local and city housing developments that are to some extent even being pegged as like new versions of public housing or public housing for the 21st century. And in these models, like in Montgomery County, we're seeing like bond reliant housing developments be created. And we're not talking enough about what those bonds are, or whether or not that constitutes decommodified housing, right? And I talk a lot about that in an op-ed that I wrote last year. So I don't want to go too far into that, but I do want to say from the outset, bonds are not benign, right? They're central to reproducing and exacerbating inequality, the inequality that not only characterizes our economy, but is making life increasingly difficult, making political wins increasingly difficult. Bonds are seen, I think, generally as a mundane aspect of public financing, but more so, really, they're a tax-free investment opportunity for a bond-holding class that expects a return on that investment, whether or not the public benefits that bond was supposed to pay for materialize. And if you're looking to understand that more, I would refer people to Sandy Brian Hager's work, who explores that question. I think the other concerning trend is that there's an emphasis on relying on cross-subsidization rather than real subsidization by the federal government. And what I argue in that op-ed is that tendency basically means that moderate and middle income households become a structural necessity and a priority in providing housing to those households. And that puts low-income neighbors and people who are in desperate need of housing sort of as secondary and reliant on housing, those moderate and middle-income households. And that's very concerning, given sort of the trends of the political moment and right now. And so I really just wanted to highlight sort of the need to think very carefully about like the funding options, like Rae was saying. And I think from my perspective also, and this probably will come up in the next question too, is, there's a need really to go back to the federal government, I think, and demand for that money. And I think that should be the short and long-term goal of the social housing movement. That's what provides the long-term stability and the deep affordability, right? And the ability to address households at all income levels. Yeah, I'll leave that there for now.
Thanks, Kristen. Fernando, you wanted to get in on this too?
Sure. Maybe I'll do a counterpoint to Kristen, which is simply, I think we're in a point of a lot of experimentation and a lot of trying to do something in the United States that I don't think has ever been done. That was perhaps part of Catherine Bauer's vision in the 1930s in the development of public housing as a counter to segregation, as an all-encompassing, integrated housing for all kind of program and system. Instead, what we got with a lot of pushback, I saw in the chat a lot of, why are we using social housing? That sounds socialist. A lot of the pushback to Catherine Bauer's vision was from a coalition against socialist housing, CASH, among other various capitalist cohorts that came together to really transform that vision into kind of housing of last resort, and that the market would be the only thing that would provide housing for everyone else. And so here we are in a system where we're reliant on tax credit investors who get a tax break in return for investing in low-income housing and market rate housing that is dependent on investors who demand minimum 16% returns on their investment. So we have this sort of bifurcated system that both of which only work for very few people and leave the rest of us out, and leave people in on the market and at the low income and also out because of the scarcity of it. So in this kind of experimentation, I think we're going to be seeing over the next 10 years a number of incremental solutions, very imperfect. So whether they rely on revenue bonds that might be getting 4 or 5% returns for those investors, they're still Wall Street investors. But it means that we start to see a broader set of housing, we might be seeing the cross subsidy that Kristen mentioned, and all along that there will be dangers, right? Does that create a certain dependence? Does that mean we're just focusing on a very narrow spectrum of workforce housing or middle income housing to the detriment of that broad vision? So I'm not sure how it's all going to pan out. I think I just wanted to share, I think it's going to be an incremental thing. And that I think our role collectively is to stay clear to the vision of that breadth of housing for everyone.
Thanks, Fernando. So I wanted to pass the baton to Jonathan and, give us a little bit of historical perspective. Is social housing new to the United States? And to the extent that it's not new, what are notable successes? What have we learned from past experiences that to sustain those efforts for the long term?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I mean, I think as our conversation has already showed, it's definitely not new. I mean, we obviously have public housing, which has been a very successful model in many parts of the country, and has been through austerity been undercut over and over and over again over time. As part of a political campaign against it. So we also have, Rae mentioned earlier the various Opportunity for Purchase Act. Someone mentioned DC's TOPA. So there are a variety of programs that have led to small bits of decommodified housing across the country. A lot of my work, as I mentioned earlier, has been on the Mitchell-Lama program in New York City, or New York City and state, and in New York City alone built over 140,000 apartments between the mid 1950s and early 1970s, much of which is still with us, particularly on the co-op side. As far as lessons that we can take, I mean, I think the idea that social housing doesn't fit the U.S., it can happen here just as fascism can and is. So this is about building the world we want to live in. And, we have existing models that do function in the states already. We've seen, broad interest and growth in community land trust as well. One thing I would say is that, we live in a world in which housing is supposed to serve many, many different purposes. It has been homeownership in particular has been propped up as a substitute for an actual social safety net. And so people are forced in many cases to try to instrumentalize their homes for profit, or to borrow against, or to risk in order to pay for other social needs. So this is actually something, I see happening in these privatization debates in Mitchell-Lama co-ops is folks say, well, how do I pay for elder care? how do I pay for this emergent healthcare need? And without that broader ecosystem of support, it's actually quite difficult to maintain these models, especially when they are they're not the norm. So, this gets easier as you scale it. It becomes more common. Folks become less attached to the idea of homeownership building wealth through appreciation of an asset, and more home as a way to build wealth through stability and savings, through low housing costs and ability to pay for other needs and other dreams. And so I think that's a key, takeaway from some of the work in New York City and state, is over time, as the pressures, the profit motives that could come from privatizing existing social housing or commodifying it, as that grows, we need to have a reaction from both the state, from residents, from our nonprofit partners. There are folks on this call who do incredible advocacy work to maintain this social housing. That sort of social maintenance is really key. We need to reaffirm the purpose of this housing again and again over time, and that's a narrative challenge as well. And Kristen was mentioning, we should be critical of the funding sources and the role of funding sources and how we preserve this. One of the things that I always note is that some of the only tools, some of the only incentives to maintain existing social housing is, oh, we're the city or state, we'll give you cheap debt. We'll give you cheap debt to pay for all of those needs, to replace the roof, to replace the windows, replace the boilers, meet these new requirements. And if that is the only mechanism, and only the only argument we have is, well, this is good for you financially, it actually reifies the idea that home is about just money. It's about what is the best financial deal here, and social housing is a great financial deal for many of its residents. We are about people's basic needs and material needs and meeting those. But in that work to maintain it, we have to also drive forward the narrative sense that, well, housing is in fact a public good, and we have to build that into our culture and our messaging, constantly. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. You mentioned scale, and so I want to ask everyone to address how do we scale up these various forms? We've mentioned several different kinds of decommodified resident governed housing, public housing, land trusts, cooperatives, various versions on that, resident-owned communities and manufactured housing. How can we take these ideas and the history that we have, and right now, in this current moment, which is a tough one, strengthen them and scale them up? What are some of the approaches to that? You're up first on this one, Fernando.
Ooh, okay. Thinking about scale and thinking about the level of commitment, I think Jonathan used the word infrastructure. And I think it's really important for both our cities and our states and for the federal government to begin to look at housing as infrastructure, as part of what makes a city or a region work and work well. If you can't house people, if they are in unstable conditions, that is not good for your economy and for whatever rest of your vision you have for people's health, et cetera. And so it should be, I think, seen as part of the infrastructure, just like transportation is, just like all the other infrastructure projects, which then sort of leads to then how do we fund this? And what we've done in the United States, this tax credit program has funded what I think maybe 2 million units of low-income housing across the United States for folks earning less than 50% of the median in their area. We have a mortgage interest relief program for homeowners that is the largest federal subsidy for housing of any kind. That's what our federal government does. It does home ownership, and then it gives tax breaks to rich people so they can invest in low-income housing. So we need to start thinking about things differently. Whether that is lower, let's just say, so I'll put it out there because this is part of the work I've been doing around a public bank, is can we do either just direct subsidies or some combination of direct subsidy, we're going to build it, or we're going to lend you the money to build it at a very low interest, something comparable to what our treasury bills are at, or maybe a little higher, 3%, 4%, something that stays on par with inflation. And so when we modeled this, even in San Francisco, even in a city that has probably one of the most expensive housing construction costs in the country, I think, anywhere between $800,000 to $1 million just to build one unit. If you are not paying the kind of returns that market rate investors want, you can build this stuff. You could build a lot of social housing. And that's where that kind of cross-subsidy comes in, not cross-subsidy for market rate developers, not cross-subsidy for investors who are trying to get their 16% returns, but actually the kind of thing that at a scale that we are used to doing as government, when we build bridges, when we build sewers, when we build all this other stuff that we consider public infrastructure. It is entirely possible, but it requires kind of a change or an expansion of how government sees its role. So it's once you change that, you'll find the solutions.
Great, thanks, Fernando. I guess I'll pass this to Kristen, and if you want to add, there's this tension, right, between, and it actually came up in a question from Chris Schild in a different way too, that public housing needs to be social housing, social housing is, so we've that phrase got delegitimized, and now there's a possibility of social housing, having the same thing. So how do we learn from that? But there's a challenge, right, in balancing housing stability for those who need it most, and getting the political support to sustain social housing. So how do you think about that? So this is sort of the universalism versus targeting question in a way.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, the question of how do we build broad support for the social housing movement or the housing movement in general, we have to think about who's the base here, right? And who are we eliciting broader support from? And I do think a lot of the times we're thinking about nonprofit affordable housing developers and that, right? And maybe some elected officials. But I think for me, the base that needs to be activated and engaged are the neighbors who are most negatively impacted by the existing housing system, or as Tracy Rosenthal and Leonardo Vilci say, the unhousing system, right? And we need to learn from the experiences and listen to the perspectives of neighbors who are confronting this life-threatening experience of being unhoused, and those who are teetering on the edge of that experience. And it's really from that vantage point, I think, that we need to deliberate on our housing futures and the models that are needed. And I think what's really concerning to me right now is that the loudest voices on social housing are saying that we need to exclude some of these neighbors in order to pursue housing for all, right? And I think I want to go back kind of to what you're saying a little bit about, successful models of social housing. I think the narrative around public housing is really negative, right? That this was a failed model. And that is a myth, right? Because that housing program is over 100 years or almost 100 years old, and is able to provide stable, affordable, long-term housing for people who would otherwise not be housed, right? It's the only social housing program that's really doing that. And the reason that that's effective is because of the federal investment in that program. And right now, if there were more federal investment in that program, The buildings could be renovated, the program could be expanded with enough sort of community power and agitation. I think we are looking at re-regulating public housing and expanding that program towards actually housing all people, right? So to me, the question is an organizing question, really, right? And I think in there, like I'm saying in the beginning of this, we have to think about who's the base here and who do we really need to be activating and who needs to be centered in the movement and defining the answers. And to me, those are the neighbors that are sort of most negatively impacted. So actually, I don't see those things at odds actually at all. I see the only way that we achieve sort of the values that we're laying out right now around housing for all and long-term stability and resident management. The only way we achieve that actually is if we reach out to neighbors that are bearing the brunt and the most violence of this unhousing system right now.
Anyone else want to address that question before we go to our last one?
I would just add that I mean I agree with Kristen that this is an organizing question. I don't think we really have the luxury to say we're going to do one or the other. I think especially how I expect we will be able to approach social housing is, investing in many models at once. And through doing that, building a broad coalition while still centering folks, as Kristen said, who are, most in the crosshairs of the violence of the existing system. So I think we can do both. I think this has to do with the many different ways of doing it. Investing in the existing models that we have, preserving the models that we already have, taking existing housing that is in the private market and socializing it through these opportunity to purchase acts, and developing new housing that is permanently affordable and social from the beginning. And each of those all of those are going to serve a variety of different kinds of people. And I think that is ultimately in service of building a durable social housing system overall and building the ecosystem that can support that durability.
I also wanted to add that I don't know that we need to, there's been a lot of debate about even using the term social housing. In fact, there's been numerous narrative research done on what to call it, if not social housing. And in fact, in many cases, legislators who have passed social housing legislation or introduced legislation that not have passed, did not even call their bill social housing. They called it something else that maybe included social housing in the actual text of the language itself, because most people don't know what social housing is and all of the stereotypes, or it doesn't quite lead to what it provides. But I don't know that it's even useful for the public to know the term. I think what's useful for the public is just to have the access of affordable housing. I think the use of the word is beneficial for policymakers and for the advocates who are calling for a different system. But I think what we really need to do is just simply change the system to one, which is what we're talking about. So that way it becomes so readily available, because most people, when you're looking for a place to buy or looking for a place to rent, you don't care what it's called. You don't even care necessarily how, the technicalities of even the ownership or the management. You just want to be able to say, this is an affordable place that I can live, and that it's a healthy place for me to raise my kids. And so that is all that people, I think, are generally asking for. And so I think that's something for us to be thinking about. I also wanted to return to one of the questions, particularly around public housing and social housing, in that we're oftentimes tiptoe around the fact that the main reason why public housing is really now being seen as the ghettoized or whatever in this mythology that we create is simply because of classism and racism. I mean, that's exactly what it is. We've completely disinvested in areas by which, and we in our minds associate public housing. When you think of public housing, because of the racist system that we've had in the history, and also, let's be honest, like Hollywood filmmaking, like I immediately think of, unfortunately, like primarily poor Black folk in a neighborhood that's been not taken care of. And that's what I think of when I think of public housing. That is not the reality. That is something that we have both projected and created ourselves as a system. And so what we need to do here in our social housing model is to say, actually, public housing as a policy is actually a solution for our country. And not only, but social housing, what can we do to ensure that social housing does not be a repeat of the classist, racist, disinvestment to lead back into that situation, and also ensure that we have very strong protections to ensure, or whatever it might be, laws, regulations, to ensure that it doesn't go down that route, so that we protect the people who are actually living in those spaces. So I don't know that necessarily the argument is about, is it mixed income? Is it not mixed income? This and that. It's about actually providing the kind of housing system that is going to ensure that everybody who lives in it is going to be able to stay in there forever and not be worried about being kicked out if they lose their job for 3 months and they're looking for something, right? Or because of the current political climate, that now if you're an immigrant, you're gonna be at high risk, of being attacked by by ICE or whatever it might be, right? That they're not, for those few years, because our federal government, or I mean, you can tell I'm biased in my perspective on the federal government, but that they're going to be at risk to stay in their house, right? And so we need to be able to ensure that this is a long-term permanent system that can actually create stability for families. And I think that's the most important thing that we need to take away from that.
That's great. Thank you, Rae. We're going to move to Q&A very quickly. I'm just going to do one last quick question, which is just to point out for and we were going to start this with you, Rae, but anyone can jump in. What is promising and possible at the state and local level right now? Sort of lightning round on.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, happy to respond to that. So we've already named, and it is hard sometimes in this moment when you open the news. I try to almost not read the news sometimes to feel really pessimistic about the opportunities of creating an equitable system for everybody, right? And particularly thinking about housing, especially as Medicaid is being cut, as Section 8 vouchers are likely going to be cut, so on and so forth, right? We're just losing a lot of our safety net. So how are we, and what's the opportunity, and what is the promise, right, of what we can do now in this moment? And that, I think, really is at the local and state levels. And I'm really excited about this, and the fact that because the federal government is basically pulling away from their ability to do their job to support the needs for our local and state level work. What it means is that the local and state level legislators are in a moment where they are trying to think creatively about what they can possibly do. There is an opening right now where people are looking for real solutions, where they're looking to figure out what to do. And this is the opportunity to really mobilize people to say, well, we can change the situation for ourselves. Maybe not and it builds out into what we can do on a federal level eventually, right? And so the things and opportunities we have right now is that there are local campaigns of organizers who are, for example, reclaiming homes that have been neglected by the state. And where actually, I don't know if you've heard of the El Sereno campaign, the Reclaim Our Homes campaign here in Los Angeles. And sorry, I'm highlighting California so much, but this is where I live and this is where I work. But where we had unhoused family members and individuals take over buildings that were for decades left alone because they were the state had originally planned on building a highway through this area. So they bought a bunch of properties, and then they just left them vacant. And they haven't done anything with them. And so unhoused organizers decided to get together and claim those homes and say, look, the state needs to do something with these homes. And they're right now trying to purchase those homes and put it into a community land trust so that these homes are actually going to be used. It is at this level, at the local and state level, that we are able to really build the kind of organizing power and movement to push our electeds and to be able to build a case for the level of expectation of what we need, and have a larger imagination about what it means for us to have a housing system that actually provides for everybody. So I would say at the local and state level, I already named for you all at the beginning of this panel about all the ways, the different policies and different organizing levels. But I would say, if I was just to answer that, we have an opportunity now, and that is to lean in to the uncomfortableness, if not anger, that people are feeling in this moment, that our safety net is being taken away, and we need to not just demand it back, but we need to take it back. And that is what is possible, and that is what is promising for us in this moment.
Great. Thank you. I think we all need to hear that. Is there any other specific local or state initiatives that you guys want to highlight before we move to some audience questions?
Well, I can
If you can
jump in with audience questions. And
go
so
for it, Steve.
yeah, and I think there's like, I'm going to try to throw out a few, because I think, I don't, like housing, it's kind of like the elephant. There's lots of different parts to it. So one question that was raised was about Mitchell-Lama and how does that work? Obviously, that's in New York City. Then there's a question about, to paraphrase the book, what about Kansas? So how do you think about social housing in a rural or more rural place as opposed to like an urban place like New York City? And then a third thing I saw was about tenants and the role of tenant management, tenant organizing. So I figured, there's multiple questions there, and each of you can like jump in where you feel most comfortable.
I can speak briefly to the Mitchell-Lama point. So Mitchell-Lama's come in both rental and limited equity co-op varieties, and the official name for the law that created it was the Limited Profit Housing Companies Act of 1955. And basically the deal was that the city and state paid, in many cases, up to 95% of the project costs. So it was, deep public investment in the construction of these developments. Those developments get a variety of ongoing subsidy, including relatively inexpensive financing, property tax abatements, and particularly in the co-op side of thing, residents are they are the owners of the building. They manage the finances of those buildings and adjust their housing costs, ongoing maintenance accordingly to take care of the needs of their community. So I won't go too much farther in the weeds than that, but I'll offer that.
Thanks. Any takers on either rural housing or tenant organizing?
Sorry, can you repeat the question around the rural and tenant organizing?
Well, there were different questions, but one was about like, how to, the role of tenant organizing and tenant management of, participation and management of properties. That this is a major concern in many places. And obviously there's a national tenant housing movement. And rural was just sort of like, we don't have social housing here in Kansas, I think was kind of the statement. So, but there is a need. It's got to be structured differently. So that was the question.
Yeah, I mean, I can respond to that in that there is social housing in rural areas. And in Inland Empire, Central Valley, for example, here in California, there are definitely um, community land trusts that are being developed. When we think of social housing, I think a lot of people tend to think of apartment buildings that are bought and and owned by communities or by nonprofits. But in the case of a lot of more rural areas, they are actually purchasing homes. And homes are actually, homes are part of community land trusts. Homes are part of, co-ops. And so it doesn't look different at all in terms of its look or in terms of its provision. It's just the building structure. It's just different. I would say the organizing challenge is more around the tenant organizing side, which is what I have found here in California, is that there is a dearth of tenant organizing in more rural areas. And that is not because of a lack of need at all, but rather it is the lack of resources oftentimes going to rural areas. There's a lot more philanthropy groups that give funding to organizations in urban areas. And because there's a lot of focus a lot of times on that, as well as the fact that when people live more closely together, I see my neighbor. I live in an apartment building, so I literally see every neighbor every time they go out of their house. I can say hi and say, "Hey, is your water working today?" And then we can talk about the challenges we face. But when you're a couple miles away, it's really hard to be able to organize collectively as much. And so there is a real need to be able to put more energy into that organizing of more of our rural areas. And I think that's something for us to really be thinking about as a whole housing movement, really in general, and not just about actually housing. Let's be honest; it's about all areas. When you do even just look at our political map, right? Like who are the folks who are joining together, banding together on more progressive, right? Like perspectives, it's usually in urban areas versus rural areas. And it's because we're just not doing the organizing and we're not collaborating and collectivizing our ideas, what we need, and the solutions we need to build. And so we're really just isolating ourselves into these bubbles. And so we got to find a way to really break down those walls and connect the dots.
I just wanted to offer really quick to piggyback on the rural question. I mean, the community land trust movement in the U.S. started with an agricultural cooperative in rural Georgia. So these models are by no means exclusive to urban areas, rural areas, or suburban areas. I mean, they can be done in any context, and there are different models that suit that. And someone mentioned earlier, manufactured housing communities. Rock USA does incredible work to help manufactured housing communities own their own land. As many people know, if you live in a quote unquote mobile home, which is not typically actually mobile, you often own the structure but not the land underneath it. That is actually a perfect setup for developing a community land trust, because that is exactly how the divorcing the ownership of a structure from the land is the fundamental way in which a community land trust works. So these models can really fit anywhere. It is an organizing challenge and a financing challenge.
Thanks.
We've got a question about how we avoid the problems, the demonizing of public housing that happened in the past. And I know we've touched on this a few times, but I just want to bring it back specifically to say, real estate interests and various others were able the first time round in this country to really demonize public housing, and what lessons can we bring out of that? Because some folks have said that one of the lessons that we get from that is that we really do need to aggressively make it serve more folks so that it cannot be shoved over into one corner and said, well, that's just for for those people, or as Kristen said before, maybe make it more people more aware that it does serve a wide range of folks. But this does seem like a central question in the organizing as we move forward with the vision that we're discussing.
Yeah, I can say a couple things about that. I mean, I think from my perspective right now, I'm actually more concerned that the social housing fight will be co-opted by capital, and not necessarily demonized, but actually what we end up calling social housing won't be the same as what our values are. And some of that to me is because of like the financing models that we do see moving forward. And even though that's the state is doing that, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's like a decommodified model, right? Actually, and I think that's some of the risk. And I think to some of what Rae was saying, to me, and what you're saying, Miriam, too, like the way that we kind of like counteract that is through organizing and building networks and channels and connecting urban and rural and yeah, like getting very clear on what we mean by social housing and getting sort of unified on what the short and long-term goals of that fight are. And I do think there's got to be a tension between building a big tent, right, and pursuing like a social housing for all model, but also making sure that, again, like people who are bearing the brunt right now of this unhousing system are centered in those spaces and in that the visioning of what the housing that we're pursuing is. Yeah, but my concern really is more so that it will be co-opted, and potentially we're seeing that happen already.
Let's see. I'll go in with another question. So there was a question in the chat about Ezra Klein's argument about the regulation raising the price of affordable housing to seemingly I've seen estimates of $500,000 to $600,000 per unit in Los Angeles, for example. I don't know if those are correct, but that's what I've seen. So are there ways of changing policy to allow for building of social housing at scale? Are there, in addition to like providing money, like we've created this system of and Shelterforce has done an amazing job of covering this, of housing tax credits as opposed to just providing grants to build housing. So that's one source of inefficiency. But how do we think about making the system more efficient in terms of monetary output that's required for per unit of housing?
I can take a stab at that since I brought up Ezra Klein at our pre-call. I think one of the things is that, and I think it goes back to the previous question, that there's something beautiful about this phrase of abundance. What we need is an abundance of investment. What we need is an abundance of public housing. When you get the developers, nonprofit or market rate or whatever kind of developers they are, off their ideological high horse and say, hey, let's look at your numbers. Soft costs are always 10 to 15%. They're like, that's the soft costs. There might be some slight variations, but that's a percent of a total cost. So that 600,000 unit is not because of regulations. That's a slight little piece. And it was the same piece that it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Of course, it's a pain in the butt to have more regulations. And of course, it would help to smooth things out and reduce those. But that is not the problem. And I think it's really important to understand, what are the things that we can improve around the edges. And when I've talked to politicians, I think, one of the things I heard back from one politician say was, well, I can't do anything about the funding, so I just have to talk about regulations, which is, just a defeat, that an admission that as a politician, they are not willing to do the work to actually talk about the kinds of investment that we need. And I think for a lot of folks, that sort of honing in on regulations, which is a real problem. I'm not saying it's not a real problem. And I think somebody in the chat mentioned length of time. It's not just cost, but it's length of time. True enough. But if you can't make your project pencil out, whether it's a fully publicly subsidized project because you don't have the full investment in there, whether it's tax credit, whether it's market rate, whatever, because the costs aren't there, and the costs are not the regulations. The costs are everything else. Is labor, materials, tariffs, you name it. And so I think that gets back to what is our vision, and that our vision has to be about the role of the public in investing in a housing infrastructure that houses folks so that we have cities that work, which was the original vision of public housing.
If I could add something to that, I think it's more that we just don't have the political will. We say that we don't have the money. We have the money. We say that there's too much regulation. If we want to get something done, we get it done. You know what I mean? What's the issue with regulation? It's okay, well, there's too many, people who need to like pass the pod and fill out the sheets and check out the space. If we had enough people and we were paying people to quickly go through the process to get it done, they'll get it done. You know what I mean? So it's not at all like we keep giving reasons to like, the system is so broken and so why we can't do it. We just need the political will to fix the system. We just need to get politicians and our electeds to just like actually own what their job is and say, it is a priority to make sure that every single person in my city and in my state and in my country is housed, and that they feel that strongly about it, they will find a way to get it done. I remember here in Los Angeles, I was talking to a community organizer, Estuardo Maziergas, who was telling me that there was a park in Los Angeles that they, in their organization ACE, Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, were working together to try and update that park. And they're asking the city, and the city is like, we can't do anything about it. We don't have the money. And so they did a huge action, and they basically forced the elected's hand. Like that, the next week, they're like, we just found $2 million lying around to fix up the park. You're like, I see. You couldn't find it. It's been years. You can't do anything about it. And we just found this pocket of money, $2 million, right? So there are ways to do this. Like, I think that I would call out all of our electeds who say, I just can't do anything. I'm in just my own little realm. I can't, no, like BS, right? Like, they have the ability to do this if they really believe in it and if they're ready to really fight for it. And that's the thing that we need. And I would say, I call on us, right, as a collective here, every single person who's listening on this call, right? Like, we have the ability and power to move. That's what democracy is, but we have to demand it and we have to take it. We have to move it. And that's what I would probably say in terms of like, the pushback.
Thanks, Rae. Miriam, you want to throw in another question?
I don't think anybody wants to follow that, but I did, since we're mentioning financing, I did want to bring up that question Fernando had mentioned earlier. Public banks, lower expectation of returns without maybe some of the issues of the larger bond market. And I just wanted to open the floor for ideas about what seems to be working at the state and local level, or what you think about interim steps where people are engaging with the market in the meantime. So somebody mentioned Grounded Solutions in the chat, and I just wanted to call out their Homes for the Future project, in which they are just buying homes back from the corporate landlords, renting them for a little while so that they can pay back the investors, but at a very specific, not 16% kind of rate, and then they're going to go into community ownership. So that's a way of sort of trying to engage and right now in a system that we don't want to be operating this way in the long run, but not waiting until it's gone, to be trying to get some homes back and under community control. So are there other, what's your vision of financing this when we have that political will to make it happen?
Well, I would just start. I mean, there was a question earlier about, what's happening at the local and state level that is positive, and I don't think everyone would agree with this, but I think the work that Seattle is doing, Chicago is doing to create public developers and fund those public developers are a great interim step forward. We need mechanisms to create this housing and creative financing solutions that are not ideal. I mean, this is going to be messy. There are going to be uh, steps along the way that do not meet all of our threshold ideas of what this housing should be, but that help us build that broader base. So I just wanted to throw out those two examples as steps in that direction that may not be perfect, but are useful.
Maybe I'll just add to that is, and alluding back to the question of scale and how do we scale up? Maybe this doesn't get it. Is it more direct subsidies? Is it public bank financing? Is it whatever the tool is? There is a question which in my previous job we'd go back and forth about how much do we talk about the scale of need and what the numbers are that we should be investing in the housing that we need. So folks in the social housing circles, they love to talk about Vienna. Vienna is sort of the cat's meow of social housing. And one of the numbers that's often thrown out is 60% of Vienna housing, all the housing, is socially subsidized in one way or another, between publicly owned housing, cooperatives, and other kinds. You look at a bunch of other cities that have done relatively well, 60% ends up being this number that's often thrown out, or that is what is being produced. In California, I don't know how this looks like in other states. The state of California requires every region to develop what's called a regional housing needs assessment, the RHNA. And it's a number that's done every 8 years. And it says, this is how much housing we should be producing based on economic growth and demographic changes and job growth. And lo and behold, the number that they come out with every 8 years is that 60% of the housing, or 60% of the population, cannot afford market rate housing of the new population. 60% of all the housing being produced ought to be some kind of subsidized housing if you were to adequately house everyone in that region, where they would not be spending more than, and we can quibble about where they came up with 30% of their income in housing. And so we have metrics that we can use. We know the scale of building and or taking over those vacant units that either the state or the capitalists are holding off from the supply in order to house everyone adequately. So there's a number we can figure that out, and that number will change depending on the region and housing costs and whatever, but we know what those should be. And then we can start to say, okay, how are we going to get that money? Are you going to take that money to build housing, or are you going to double your police force, or are you going to tax sales of multi-million-dollar properties, or whatever it might be that is the revenue source that will get to meeting that goal?
All right. We are at time, so we're going to end with that vision in front of us of 60% of our housing and as social housing. And thank you all so much for your really active engagement in the chat. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to NPQ for co-sponsoring this with us. As always, you guys do wonderful work. Please subscribe to Shelterforce if you haven't already, to our newsletters. Subscribe to NPQ's newsletters and keep up the conversation.